Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm back again to do some healthy meals on a budget with you. And today we are going to be making a creamy potato soup. So if you've been paying attention to the previous videos, we're kind of focusing on highlighting foods that contain vitamin D, and sometimes I need to do things to increase that vitamin D content in recipes, but sometimes I have plenty and I don't have to do a whole lot at all. But we also want to get some good fiber in the food and potassium, forgetting my words again. So yeah, we want to make sure we have foods that have plenty of potassium. I've also been kind of harping on the added sugar content of things. In case you haven't noticed though, like when we're making things ourselves, we are not having to worry a lot about that added sugar. And the point I need to make with that is a lot of processed foods will include added sugar to help with flavoring, preserving it, and all of that, to keep it shelf stable, meaning they can put it on a shelf in the store and it won't spoil on us. So that has not had to play a huge role, but I still point it out if there's going to be sugar in any of my recipes. And so with this creamy potato soup, just like with the other ones, I'm taking already established recipes out there and making some changes, some big, some small, and today is no different. Actually, a lot of this recipe stays very close to the same as its original, but I've done some things to slightly increase that vitamin D, definitely increase the fiber, and potassium had some changes as well, but even though it's not part of what I'm really going for, the whole idea is healthy, so I've actually figured out a way to kind of reduce the fat, and particularly the saturated fat, in this creamy potato soup recipe. So I'm going to wash my hands first. It's always very important to wash hands before we start cooking. We don't want to get any germs in the food that we're eating for ourselves and for our families, and that's what we are trying to do, is make some really good healthy meals for our families, not have to spend a whole lot of money on doing it, and not just a huge amount of time, because we all have busy lives. This was one of my longer recipes. It estimates taking about 50 minutes to do. No, you're not going to have to watch 50 minutes versus 50 minutes of recipe showing making. I don't plan to make you watch pots boil, so we'll kind of skip ahead on those parts. But to begin with, we want it to have some potatoes, some carrots, some onion, and some celery. So I've mostly got everything chopped already, except for a couple of things, because I want to show you how we do that effectively and safely. So I've already peeled this carrot, and I'm going to cut that top off where that stem would be, and the very little bit of that very tip, because those tend to have parts that we aren't trying to eat attached to them. So one easy thing to do with a carrot is, a little bit of the peel still on it, is to actually slice that down the center. And I tell you, even with the other ones, it's really tough. Carrots are a very tough vegetable. And so what I'm trying to do is actually create a flat surface on that carrot so that I can turn it like that, and it makes it a little easier, not rolling around all over the place. You could potentially just slice, but then to get that diced effect, you'll be individually slicing each of those circles. And I am trying to eliminate the extra time in the cutting. So yeah, I just sliced that one slice down the middle, and now I'm slicing across and trying to keep my fingers away. The knuckles should always be facing that knife and the fingertips away from it. I admittedly sometimes have a hard time keeping hold of but you see I've got my fingertips down and away, and the knuckles are what are closest. And I have a really tough carrot today. I love that it likes to make me into a fumbling carrot cutter. And you do. You want a really good sharp knife, and this is a really good sharp knife. It's just, you know, with carrots being root vegetables, they're very woody when they're raw. High fiber, actually rather lower in carbohydrates by volume. Like you can have an entire cup of raw carrot, and it's only 5 grams of carbohydrate versus a lot of other, starchy vegetables that would be more like 15 grams of carbohydrate. And so a few of these pieces, I just want to get a little bit smaller. And I do have the scraper I've been talking about with me today. But as I've mentioned before, that if you're kind of trying to scoop up and, you know, that knife is real tempting to use as scooping up, make sure you're using that flat side, that dull side, to help scoop the vegetables up into what you're cooking. So we're going to put those in this little bowl, sip out here real quick. So next up, I'm going to tear away 2 celery stalks from my bunch here. Since celery is kind of a quick cut, I went ahead and decided I'll just show you how to do them quickly. But yeah, we rinse celery. There's always dirt on produce. It may seem like it looks pretty clean, but there's always going to be dirt. They have kind of washed it off, but in travel, it gets dirt. If it's straight off the farm, then also it's definitely going to have dirt. But those sprinklers you see them using in the grocery store are just kind of keeping them fresh for you until you can buy it and take it home. So they're not actually washing your produce for you. So I'm using the same cutting board for all my vegetables because all these vegetables are going into the same pot cooking on the same temperature. So any kind of contamination that can cross between the two is going to be taken care of in one spot over here at the stove. So I'm cutting away the leafy parts, and the very end of the stalk where it looks really rough, where it was against that main stalk. So you'll take a little bit of that white with it. So the recipe says to dice the celery. It's kind of the same concept as with our carrots, where you kind of get that slice down the middle. And sometimes that doesn't make a perfect line for me. Now if you like the little curvy slices of carrot, you can do that too. Really soft in that soup. They may even become something that you can hardly tell is there. This is a great recipe for getting vegetables into your children. And it's a nice fall recipe. I know that at the time of me recording this, we're right here smack dab in kind of early-ish mid-July, and it's just as hot as it can be. But I love soup. I know a lot of people who love soup. But if you prefer to save this recipe for the fall, when it's starting to get cool outside, soup is a great fall food. Just trying to get that all chopped up. And I've got a little bowl waiting over here for me to put all of this celery into. A little closer. To one side here. Okay. As mentioned, I get to cut all these vegetables on the same cutting board because they're all going into the same place. So now what we need are, so I used 3 medium-sized carrots, 2 celery stalks. Now we're going to slice up our potatoes. I've done some of that already. And I did it just right before we started this recording, because a little something you need to know with potatoes is they can change color when exposed to air for too long. It can last a little bit, but you start hitting half an hour to an hour and they actually will start to turn pink. So we need 5 medium russet potatoes. So here's one of my bigger differences in how I'm doing my recipe compared to the original, is it says to peel and dice the potatoes. I have decided for the added fiber that what I want to do is keep that skin on to contribute to that fiber. And potatoes provide potassium, which we want, fiber, also what we want. And something really cool that happens when potatoes are cooked is they form something called resistant starches. And these are really important to our gut health. So, resistant starches are actually a type of fiber that acts as a prebiotic. You've probably heard of probiotics, which is intestinal bacteria that you introduce through eating things like yogurt and other fermented dairies and that sort of thing. And that promotes good bacteria and other microorganisms in your large intestine, your colon. And so we're going about 3/4 of an inch in size on these dices too. So that resistant starch actually acts as something called a prebiotic that helps feed that good bacteria that you want in your colon, that helps promote that good gut health. So, keeps you regular, helps keep you from getting sick, that helps with the completion of your digestion of your food. So, really good stuff. You can find that in bananas as well. We had a banana pancake recipe earlier on. So I'm almost done dicing my potatoes. Get them into this bowl right here. Okay, so what I was saying about those potatoes being exposed to the air too long is that after a bit, they might try to start to turn pink. Doesn't really do anything to the flavor, but kind of off-putting. Even more off-putting is once you cook a pink potato, it turns green when it cooks, so we don't really want it to do that. So usually making sure that's like one of the last things you slice up before you put it in the pot to cook is a good idea. So I've got a medium onion. So I peeled it, that kind of twisty part at the end I've already cut off, and I'm going to leave that fuzzy end on the end to kind of help keep the onion held together for me while I do this dicing. Okay, so I've kind of shown this once before when this bowl is out of the way. So I make a couple of sideways slices into our onion here, and then some long way slices toward the end of that onion, and then cut that across, and we have diced tomatoes. Not tomatoes, onions. Why did I say tomatoes? We don't even have any tomatoes in this recipe. So that's 1/2 already done. It makes it really quick too. Get right here and do this other onion. Same way as before. Long slices on the long side of that onion, and then across again. And we have ourselves some diced onions. Scraper. Get this put into this little bowl. Just makes it really easy for me to show you when I have everything in their bowls. So over here, I have a pot. It's a stock pot really, and I'm going to turn the heat on This one's complicated because it has different size burners, so it's not my home stove. My church has been letting me use their kitchen, and I'm still getting familiar. And I want to have my burner at about medium high or a little closer to high, not super high. We're not going for like violent boil or what they call a rolling boil, but we want to get this up to a boil, and I'll explain what we're getting up to a boil. So what I am going to do is I'm going to put each of our vegetables into this pot. And as you can see, it needs to be a decent sized pot for all those potatoes. And they'll soften and cook down. Our carrots. Our celery. And our onions. So, what this soup needs? It needs liquid. So, we are starting with the clearer portion of this soup. So, these vegetables need to come to a boil in some chicken broth. I've chosen unsalted chicken broth to kind of keep that sodium content down. And so, I call for 4 cups, which just so happens to be the size of this neat box that it comes in. Okay, and I think so, and then it calls for salt and pepper to taste. That's always kind of a little bit aggravating at times to have it be salt and pepper to taste, because it does. It leaves you wondering, well, what? Well, with this much food, serving 6 in this pot, rule of thumb for me is let's start with a half a teaspoon for a good size recipe. Actually, it serves 5 people, not 6. And so I got start with a half a teaspoon of salt and a quarter of a teaspoon of pepper to start off with, and get that stirred in. And if you find when you give it a taste later on that it's still not really getting that flavor, yeah, that's the point at which you can add a little more, but add just like a pinch at a time. And then you need to give it a minute or two to actually like dissolve and incorporate into that dish, that soup, whatever you're making, so that you can tell whether or not that does it. A little goes a long way. We like to say a little dabble do ya at home. So we are going to allow that to come up to a boil. Now I'm not going to force you to watch, like I said, the pot boil for 10. It takes about 10 minutes for that to come up to a boil. So we will we'll have a little break, and I'll come back to you and we'll show you the next step of what we're going to do. Okay, so we are reaching our boil now. So once we reach that point, we have a little more simmering to do. We're going to turn that heat down to medium. I am going to give it a quick little stir to make sure some of these vegetables that are toward the top get their chance to be lower down in the pot, closer to the heat source. And so I'm going to put that lid back on, and we have about 15 to 20 minutes more of that simmering. There's my little alarm going off to tell me that it's been about 10 minutes in case I got distracted. And so yeah, that's got about 15 to 20 minutes, but we'll be checking on it here and there. We want those potatoes to be getting soft. That's what we're looking for. So as we're hitting 15 minutes, you're gonna give it the potatoes a poke with the fork. Okay, just have some steam condensating out around the edges. So yeah, we're gonna give it about another 15 minutes. We're gonna check to see if the potatoes are getting softer for us. I'm already starting to get things out to move on to our next step. So yeah, we'll just have another little break, and I will come back and show you the creamy prep that we're going to do to turn this into a creamy potato soup. Okay? So our potatoes are getting close. I just checked them, and I'm able to get a fork to go in pretty easily. But you know, they've still got a couple more minutes to cook to get soft enough to be that that consistency we want for our soup. But here comes the part of our recipe where we make what is going to make our soup creamy. And this is also the portion where the vitamin D comes in. That important vitamin D that I've been talking about, good for bone health, good for the regulation of cells we're making. Remember, we talked about how vitamin D assists the body in deciding whether we've made enough cells or not. This is important for things like cancer and other things, and we don't. There's a limit to how much we want of any kind of cell in the body, but that plays a really important role in that. And then of course, you know, as we age, bones soften, and vitamin D is, you know, effective in preventing that softening of bone. So one thing we need to know is that milk is not naturally something that contains vitamin D, and you got to make sure that you are checking labels, because we're looking for that fortification in our milk, where it is including that vitamin D to get that, and that's how we're getting it into this dish as well. So I'm not actually starting with the milk. So this saucepan has been warming for a couple of minutes. Doesn't feel very warm yet. I'll turn up its heat just a little bit. Okay, and what we're going to do is we are going to add some butter and let it melt. Now, their recipe exclusively wanted to use like slightly over 5 tablespoons of butter. I've actually cut that back to 2 tablespoons because in the interest of keeping this healthy and lowering our saturated fat, I decided, well, we want a little bit of that creamy butteriness in, but I'm going to replace some of the fat with some olive oil, which provides monounsaturated fat instead of that saturated fat that can raise our cholesterol levels and contribute to things like atherosclerosis, which is, you know, the clogging up of our arteries. So letting that get melted in our saucepan here. Still going to have a couple more minutes on that. Hopefully I can get our milk, our creamy mixture done. So with, I had a tablespoon here. I think it's right over here. I washed it. That's right. So taking some of the butter out, adding a little of olive oil in instead, and so I'm going to be adding 2 tablespoons of olive oil. Which contains monounsaturated fat, which is very good for the heart. Sometimes gets forgotten about because we think of omega-3s, which is absolutely excellent. But you know, they're not the only horse in this show. Put that right here. So still getting that butter to melt. And allowing that oil to heat with the butter. Already smells good. Take that off. We are looking pretty good over here. It's getting pretty soft, so we want to get our mixture going. Still just the tiniest bit of butter not melting. So butter also has just the tiniest bit of vitamin D that it can contribute to this recipe, but I figured out a couple of other ways to help bring that vitamin D back because I am using less butter. So let's see here. I'm checking with my recipe to make sure I'm doing this. We're making a roux, and I want to make sure I'm doing this in the right order. And sometimes when you're focusing on trying to record instruction to teach people how to do this, you might miss a step. So now, once this is all incorporated, we're wanting to add 1/3 of a cup that I've pre-measured of flour, and this helps to thicken our roux. I'm going to turn that back down just a little bit. And we want to whisk that while we add that in. And ceramic top stoves have this tendency to slide a little rather than your average burner. So then from there, what we want is to bring in the vitamin D and more of the creaminess. And I've chosen low-fat milk because I'm still trying to maintain that creamy flavor. It's okay if you decide to go with 1% or even skim. No big deal. I'm going to be using 2.5 cups of milk. But for the sake of having some realism about this, I mean, if it's a creamy soup, it does need some of that fat. So, because this is only a 2-cup measuring cup, I need to remember that I'm still going to be adding another 1/2 cup of milk to this. Again, because I still need one more 1/2 cup. I do have an actual, like, next bigger cup is a 4 cup. I find it a little bit cumbersome if I'm not actually filling it. Yeah, that's 1/2. So I'd rather just use my 2 cup and need to add to it. Try to bring this back over for me to look at real quick. So we've added that, and we want to let that milk get heated up, and that mixture should start to thicken as it gets warmer. I can feel it starting to thicken now. It can feel a little bit like trying to watch water boil to do this, but yeah, we've got that vitamin D content coming into it from that milk, and potassium from our potatoes. There's even potassium in the broth. Everything has a little bit. The largest portion of our potassium is going to be coming from both the potatoes and the milk. The milk actually has quite a bit of potassium in it as well. We've got our fiber coming from the potatoes, particularly the potato skins and the resistant starch that is present in cooked potatoes. Fun little fact is this resistant starch actually becomes higher, more potent when potatoes are cooled. So, little plus to that when we're talking about things like potato salad and you're using cooked potatoes that you've cooled off. So, I'm supposed to be whisking constantly, and I'm a left-handed human who's trying to figure out how to face you and talk to you at the same time. So while I'm trying to get that to thicken, we can talk a little bit about some of the comparisons between the two recipes. Okay, one would be that the original recipe, I'm losing it here. Contained, there it is, I'm sorry. Contained actually about 426 calories per serving. So, doesn't seem, I'm sorry, no, ours is 426 calories per serving. Fun to do while you're trying to cook and talk. Theirs was actually 441 calories. So we did bring down the calorie content a little bit. We replaced some fats, and I slightly reduced the amount of it. So generally, we're going to have change in overall fat, but we're kind of replacing one with the other, one that's healthier for one that's less healthy. And then the other thing is we have increased our fiber. Theirs had 4 grams of fiber that came from mainly the vegetables. Because I've left the skins on our potatoes in particular, our fiber content is now 6 grams. And their potassium was at 1,177 milligrams. I've been able to increase that potassium to 1,578. And they still have quite a bit of vitamin D in their soup because, yeah, the milk is just bringing it. But I'll show you in a minute. I have replaced the sour cream they want to put in at the end with some plain yogurt instead, and that actually contains a little bit of vitamin D that adds to this. So while they had 71.8 international units of vitamin D, I have been able to increase that to 73.6. So now, once again, no sugars involved in making this because we are making a fresh soup. And yes, I keep constantly whisking so that we can prevent any scorching from happening on the bottom of this pan. And now I am really finally starting to get that thickening I've been looking for, and I hate to make you wait for it, but you know how it is making thickened sauces and gravies and stuff. Sometimes they want to happen too fast for you and you're not quite ready for them, and other times they can take a moment to come up. I'd rather they take a little longer and I don't risk burning the bottom, to be honest with you. But we've got that nice thickness here. I'm going to turn off this burner. Here, and I'm going to add that into our vegetable and broth mixture. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to adjust this camera a little bit so that we can see what's going on. Move a couple of things out of the way. So right here at the last, I'm just wanting you to see that I gently stir in that milk, butter, and olive oil mixture into our soup. So the very last thing we do, and I removed it from heat because it said to do that, was very last thing I'm going to do is add one last little bit of creaminess to it. So it called for having a half a cup of sour cream, which sour cream tends to be high-fat food, and yeah, and we're talking saturated fat, and then also a high-calorie addition to it. So what I found was that some whole-fat yogurt, plain yogurt, it provides that same kind of flavor, but it's a bit lower in fat, definitely, fewer calories involved. And so I'm just going to, you know what, so I think it should slide right in. I'll use this to help me. And I choose a whole fat because when it comes to the sour creams and the yogurts being added into hot mixtures, the lower, if they're too low in fat, they'll actually kind of separate and look kind of clotted in there, kind of messes with the texture of your food, and it's not very visually appealing either. And I'm not trying to just like take all fat out of this. As far as like a creamy soup, we need some fat. But what I can tell you is that compared to the other recipe, it had up there at about 19 grams of total fat. I got it down to 14. It had about 11 grams of saturated fat. I got it down to 7 grams of saturated fat. And so it has thickened up nicely. I need a ladle rather than this spoon to help me out. I've got a bowl here. And what we want to do is just ladle in some of that soup. So some things you can do is, you know, you can serve this with a, you can serve this up with a salad on the side. If you need a little extra protein or whatever, serve it with some baked or broiled chicken. You know, if you want to have a little bit of a serving of meat with it, if that's what you need, and that was hot. So also a little piece of crusty bread. You can top this with some chopped up scallions, maybe, you know, sprinkle a few croutons on top if that's what you like, but I think it makes a nice meal. Great for fall and winter, definitely, and just full of some good nutritious stuff that we need in our everyday diet. So my recipe is going to be in the description, along with all the nutrition information and the comparisons with our old recipe that we've made changes to. So I'm really hoping that you guys enjoy this, and so you have a great day, a great dinner, and thanks for watching.